operating room or the emergency room. And they say from this perspective, they can see exactly what's going on down below. They can understand the remarks and the thoughts of the personnel, the medical personnel who are around. They say after a time in this very unusual experience that they're having a great deal of difficulty understanding. And in fact, how can I be up here watching me down there? It doesn't seem to make any sense to them. After a while, they realize that although they can see clearly and understand perfectly what's going on, no one seems to be able to see or to hear them. So they undergo an experience in which they realize that this is something to do with what we call
also the reports of cardiac surgeon is consistent with in the reports and the hospital case reports are consistent with what the other near-death experience researcher has found interviewing with these patients. Also, the cardiac surgeons report the same story in their point of view in the surgery room. One of my favorite interviews is with Dr. Lloyd Rudy, the famous cardiac surgeon. I want to just listen to this 5-minute talk also.
I'm Dr. Mike Logan. I'm here with Dr. Lloyd Rudy, one of the most famous cardiac surgeons. Dr. Rudy, thanks so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
You know, we don't get the opportunity to be in the operating room, or even most people don't get the opportunity to visit with a cardiac surgeon who has had experiences with people near death, or some who've already been pronounced dead and come back. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. In particular, one case, and may touch on another. Dr. Rudy, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
We had a very unfortunate individual who, on Christmas Day, had, from an oral infection, infected his native valve. If your native valve has the slightest defect, whether you were born with it or you developed it later, it calcified a little and the valve leaflets don't move or whatever, the body recognizes that as something abnormal that it's got to take care of.
Okay.
So that's what happened to this man, and one of my junior partners was on call, and he had to do an emergency valve resection. Once we were able to accomplish the repair of the aneurysm and the replacement of the valve, we could not get the person off of the bypass. Every time the 4 or 5 liters of blood that we were pumping around his body, we would reduce down to 2 or 3, he'd begin to weaken and his blood pressure would go down and so on. To make a long story short, we simply couldn't get him off the heart-lung machine.
Right.
Finally, we just had to give up. I mean, we just said, we cannot get him off of the heart-lung machine, so we're going to have to pronounce him dead. So we did that. And so the anesthesiologist turned his machine off, and the bellows that were breathing for the patient stopped. That machine was quiet. The anesthesiologist went into the surgeon's lounge. He hadn't eaten anything all day, so he went in to have a sandwich. And the people who usually clean up the instruments and all that were coming in and taking away all these tools. And my surgical assistant closed the patient in a way that a post-mortem exam could be done, because anyone who succumbs on the table has to, by law, has to have an autopsy. So he closed him up briefly. Did a couple, 3 wires here and a big stitch to close his soft tissue. Well, the machine that records the blood pressure and the pulse and the left atrial pressure and all of the monitoring lines and things continued to run the paper out onto the floor in a big heap. Nobody bothered to turn it off. And then we put down a transesophageal echo probe. which is just a long tube that has a microphone on the end of it, and we can get a beautiful picture on a monitor of the heart beating. Well, that machine was left on, and the tape, the VCR tape, continued to run.
Right.
Well, the assistant surgeon and I went in and took our gowns off and gloves and masks and things, and came back, and we were in our short sleeve shirts, and we were standing at the door kind of discussing if there was anything else we could have done, any other medicines we could have given, whatever, to have made this a success. And as we were standing there, it had been at least 20 minutes. And, you know, I don't know this exact time sequence, but it was close to 20, 25 minutes that this man recorded no heartbeat, no blood pressure, and the echo showing no movement of the heart, just sitting there. And all of a sudden we looked up, and the surgical assistant had just finished closing it, and we saw some electrical activity. And pretty soon the electrical activity turned into a heartbeat. Very slow, 30, 40 a minute. And we thought, well, that's kind of an agonal thing, and we see that occasionally, that the heart will continue to beat even though the patient can't generate a blood pressure or pump any blood. Well, pretty soon we look and he's actually generating a pressure. No, we're not doing anything. I mean, the machines are all shut off, and we're stopped all the medicines and all that. And so I start yelling, "Get anesthesia back in here, and get the nurses." And to make a very long story short, without putting him back on cardiopulmonary bypass, heart-lung machine and stuff, we started giving him some medicines, and anesthesia started giving him oxygen, and pretty soon he had a blood pressure of 80, and pretty soon a blood pressure of 100, and his heart rate was now up to 100 a minute, you know. He recovered and had no neurologic deficit. And for the next 10 days, 2 weeks, all of us went in and were talking to him about what he experienced, if anything. And he talked about the bright light at the end of the tunnel, as I recall, and so on. But the thing that astounded me was that he described that operating room floating around and saying, "I saw you and Dr. Catania standing in the doorway with your arms folded talking. I didn't know where the anesthesiologist was, but he came running back in. And I saw all of these post-its sitting on this TV screen. And what those were any call I got, the nurse would write down who called and the phone number and stick it on the monitor, and then the next post-it would stick to that post-it, and then I'd have a string of post-its of phone calls I had to make. He described that. I mean, there's no way he could have described that before the operation because he didn't have any calls.
No.
Right?
And he's sitting on,
And
he's
he's-
lying on the, so he must have been floating.
He was up there.
Yeah.
He described the scene things that there's no way he knew. I mean, he didn't wake up in the operating room and see all this.
No.
I mean, he was out.
Right.
And was out for, I don't know, even a day or two.
Right.
While we recovered him in the intensive care unit. So what does that tell you? What does that tell you? Was that his soul up there?
It's hard to know. But
It
it certainly brings that possibility into play.
It always makes me very emotional.
It is so good of you to share this with people who don't get the opportunity to be at those near-death or post-death experiences. Is there any last things that you'd like to say?
Well, just that I presented this case to 13 other cardiac surgeons throughout the country in a special meeting, and they had several similar experiences, not quite as dramatic as the one I had, but everybody that deals with that every day has had those experiences. So it's not just me.
Right, exactly.
So
Dr. Rudy, thank you so much for sharing.
you're welcome.
These pieces that I show you are just simple pieces that you can find on YouTube with similar reports like this. There are cases, even hospital case report, your paper you can get online. So it's just, I think it's the matter of we spend time and dig more to find more about these experiences, because I think the people who are dealing with, in particularly cardiac surgeons and psychiatrists who are dealing with this line of research, are kind of, it's a very ordinary thing for them because they are dealing with it every day. But we, which is not our primary major, we find them very astonishing and very unbelievable, because we have to go through these reports to see, okay, what's happening, how we can explain these in terms of neurological functions. And if we can, then it just, we have to admit that there is something else going on that we don't know about the consciousness, about ourselves. Brings the possibility of thinking about an undying sort of consciousness beyond, expands beyond the moment of death. There is another 25, 26 minutes kind of presentation done by Dr. Jeffrey Long, which was the founder of Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. He has also investigated all the near-death experiences. He has created a bank of near-death experiences that happen in the United States and interviewed people to try to validate just a few of them. And as the last part of my lecture, we want to just listen to his findings too, which is very consistent with the other researchers in this area.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and a heartfelt thanks to the NOR Foundation for the opportunity to come out here and talk tonight about a topic that I've been, as you said, investigating for over a decade. I finally wrote my first book where we presented the findings of over a decade of research, the largest study of near-death experience that's ever been presented. And I'll be sharing with you a brief overview of the findings of my research today. I'll be talking about near-death experiences, and after effects of near-death experiences are the typically consistent change in beliefs and values that occur after these traumatic experiences. Well, we've talked a lot today already about a near-death experience. I want to start by defining what I consider a near-death experience to be. I think consistent with what most people would believe a near-death experience is, there's two components. The first is you have to be near-death. In other words, you have to have had an illness, traumatic event, or something in which you are so physically compromised that you are unconscious or may actually be clinically dead, as it may be shifting in definition, but clinically dead at least in the sense that you're not breathing on your own and you have no spontaneous heartbeat. These people are truly experiencing a close brush with death, so severe that if their physical condition did not improve, they would suffer permanent, irreversible death. But at the time when these people are unconscious, which by the very definition of unconsciousness means that there should be no possibility of an experience, they do have an experience. That's why it's called a near-death experience. We'll be looking closely at the experience part of near-death experiences in some detail tonight. I would emphasize as an overview that no two near-death experiences are the same. However, when you study large numbers of near-death experiences, the consistency of elements of things that occur during a near-death experience is striking. And that has certainly been my observation and all other major scholarly studies in this phenomenon over the 35 years that it's been studied. Who has near-death experiences? Well, as Dr. Parnia said, about 10 to 20% of people that have a close brush with death that nearly die will have a near-death experience. Interestingly, in 1982, a Gallup poll was published indicating that perhaps as many as 5% of American adults had a prior life history of a near-death experience. Near-death experiences can happen to children and adults. They can happen to physicians and scientists, and believe me, I've heard from a lot of physicians and scientists that have had these experiences. Priests, ministers, the religious and atheists, even people who have never heard of near-death experience and couldn't even conceive it was possible. All of these people can have near-death experiences, and in fact, their near-death experiences are strikingly the same. And in fact, the research that we've done has involved inviting people worldwide to share their near-death experiences, and the similarity, the striking consistency of the element of near-death experiences is seen from accounts worldwide, including Western and non-Western civilizations. Well, after 35 years of scholarly research, at this point in time, we simply cannot predict who will have a near-death experience at the time of a life-threatening event, nor can we predict what the content of that near-death experience will be. The rather remarkable conclusion is that theoretically anybody at the time of a life-threatening event, if you're one of those 10 or 20%, could possibly have a near-death experience. Well, what is a physician doing here talking about near-death experience? That's quite a bit different from my medical specialty of radiation oncology, to put it mildly. Well, when I was doing my residency training, I happened quite by accident on an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. It had the title Near-Death Experience in it. And I stopped. I was puzzled. I stopped looking for my article on cancer and read it. And I was fascinated. And I remember thinking, how is it possible that people can have such strikingly similar experiences while unconscious, while clinically dead, and how can they be so similar worldwide? Well, that got my attention up, and even though I was studying my medical specialty of radiation oncology, I tried to pay as much attention as I could to the literature on near-death experience. And then I had a life-changing event 2 years later. I heard my first in-person near-death experience. A friend of mine was visiting where I was at the University of Iowa in Iowa City and had his new wife with him. And during the course of dinner that evening, his wife mentioned that while she was undergoing general anesthesia, she had a severe allergic reaction to one of the anesthetic agents, and she coded. That means her heart stopped. And time stood still as I wrestled with the concept. I said, this would be the dumbest question to ask. Here you are under general anesthesia, and your heart stops. That's doubly medically inexplicable to have any possible conscious experience. And yet, at the time I said, if I don't ask it, I'll regret it. So finally I got up the nerve about half a minute later and said, well, okay, you're under general anesthesia and you coded. Did anything happen? Did you have an experience? And she said, why, yes. And described how her consciousness went above her body, how she saw and heard the flat EKG, the time that her heart had stopped in surgery, how she saw her frantic resuscitation efforts, and then went on to describe a very detailed near-death experience. I was flabbergasted. Immediately at that time, I said to myself, if this really happens, if this is a consistent thing that happens and can happen, this certainly changes my view of the consciousness, my view of the universe. And so many, many years later, I set up a website, Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, and that's its URL up there. This was set up over a decade ago with the intent of studying near-death experiences. At the current time, we have a very detailed questionnaire, actually 150 questions. I have a tremendous amount of respect for anybody that fills those out, and yet vast numbers of people do. So over the decade, more than a decade that we've been studying this, we've received over 1,300 near-death experiences. This is by far the largest study of near-death experiences that's ever been reported. So we not only have large numbers of near-death experiences to study, but we're also studying them in tremendous depth with the question we have. And I was delighted to find that there's been several dozen good randomized studies that found that responses to internet survey questions appear to be absolutely equally reliable to the more conventional pencil and paper questions. So I'm more convinced than ever that the data that I'm going to be presenting here is indeed what it is. In fact, it brings me to a basic scientific principle. One of the guiding scientific principles in my research is that what's real is consistently observed. What I'm going to be presenting here is observed with overwhelming consistency throughout these 1,300 near-death experiences. And in fact, there's consistency not only with my own personal study, but there's been hundreds of prior scholarly articles in the leading medical and scientific journals. I mean, I was certainly no pioneer. It's been 35 years where these hundreds of scholarly articles have been published, so there's actually a good body of literature. And while I'm going to be sharing some pretty dramatic observations about near-death experience, please understand that my major study findings have been corroborated with scores of prior scholarly studies that looked at these specific areas. So this isn't my unique observations. These are corroborated with many, many other studies. So another thing I want to emphasize is while sometimes you can get lost in the numbers. 1,300 near-death experiences. Every single one of these people had a name, a face, a dramatic close encounter with death that touched themselves, their loved ones, their family, and went on to tell the story about that. And I never want to lose sight of the human side about the struggle people go through to get over their life-threatening event, find the courage ultimately to share their dramatic experience with others around them, and ultimately with researchers so that we can learn about these dramatic experiences. We're going to talk about some of in some depth, a few of what I consider to be the more striking elements of near-death experiences. There's about 10 or 12 different, depends on the author, 10 or 12 different elements that have been described, and we'll talk at some length about them. Well, the first thing that is fairly obvious when you study near-death experiences is that they have clear consciousness. Don't forget that this is happening at a time of unconsciousness from physical compromise or even clinical death. To understand how dramatic that is, please be aware of what happens at the time of a cardiac arrest. Or a heart attack, I've learned well from Dr. Parnia. But really a cardiac arrest, which means the heart stops. When the heart stops beating, immediately blood flow stops flowing to the brain. The heart can't pump it up there. When the blood stops flowing to the brain, 10 to 20 seconds later, the EEG, electroencephalogram, a measure of brain electrical activity, goes flat. In other words, there's no measurable brain electrical activity. And yet, during this time period, when near-death experiencers may observe their often frantic resuscitation efforts, these experiences are happening at a time when it should be absolutely medically inexplicable. Well, in my study of 613 near-death experiences that all responded to the same question, did they really have clear consciousness, or were they perhaps their consciousness impeded by their unconsciousness or clinical death? Well, interestingly, in response to the question, how did your level of consciousness and alertness during your experience compare to your consciousness and alertness during your everyday normal life, a whopping 74.4% said that during the NDE they had more consciousness and alertness than normal. 19.9% normal consciousness and alertness, and then only a small minority, 5.7%, thought their level of consciousness and alertness was reduced at the time they were, by all physical measurements, clinically unconscious. And in fact, certainly another stern test for how clear consciousness can exist during near-death experiences are, as in the example I gave with the wife of my friend, that being near-death experiences under general anesthesia. Under adequate general anesthesia, there should be no possibility of a conscious perception. And then add on top of that a cardiac arrest, which of course is carefully documented during the general anesthesia. That's part of what anesthesiologists do. In my study, we studied 26 NDEs that to me looked very convincingly occurring during general anesthesia, and looking at 33 elements of the near-death experience from the questionnaire, I compared the responses of the NDEs under anesthesia group to NDEs occurring under all other circumstances. 32 out of 33 elements of NDE were identical between the two groups, including the critical question, what was your level of consciousness and alertness? And I think NDEs under general anesthesia being very typical NDEs with equivalent consciousness and alertness to all other NDEs, very, very powerful evidence indeed that we do have the ability, there seems to be the potential for consciousness to exist apart from what we conventionally think of normal physical brain function. But we have other lines of evidence too. You heard Dr. Parnia talk about a very touching story about a 3-year-old girl who rose up above her body and even drew a picture of that. Well, that's been an object of considerable study in the near-death experience arena. It's called the out-of-body experience. Typically, this happens early in the course of a near-death experience. Consciousness rises typically above the body. From that vantage point, they can often see ongoing earthly events. I observed that in about 45% of near-death experiences shared in my series. Well, a real critical question is, what are they seeing? Is it real? In other words, what they're observing of ongoing earthly events, is it real or is it hallucinatory? Well, that's been addressed by two good prospective studies. One of them by Dr. Sabon was an interesting study of cardiac arrest survivors. These are people whose heart actually stopped. And there were two groups, about several dozen that had a near-death experience, and in addition to that, they had an out-of-body experience and observed their own resuscitation. Dr. Parnia asked this group to describe their resuscitation. His control group were people that had a cardiac arrest who did not have a near-death experience. He asked them to describe their resuscitation too. The people that had a near-death experience were, in general, tremendously accurate in describing what really happened at the time of their resuscitation. In fact, he had one case report where the person having a near-death experience and observing their own resuscitation correctly described the serial number on the defibrillator used to bring them back to life. The people that had no near-death experience either said they couldn't guess what happened, or they made an educated guess based on what they were aware of on TV. And believe me, as I and Dr. Parney know, what's typically described as a resuscitation on TV is usually not what happens in the real world. The crash cart doesn't magically appear where you want to. There's some frantic behavior. There may be, I hate to say this, Dr. Parney, but sometimes unprofessional behavior, and sometimes it's doctors. So that's our little secret. Yeah, occasionally, but anyway. But that's what we hear over and over from the people who describe their near-death experience, and it's a concept they simply could not have had from any other way of knowing what really happens during a near-death experience. Well, the INDER for my Near-Death Experience Research Foundation study, I found 287 people who had this out-of-body experience and was able to describe some ongoing earthly events. I studied this to see if either the person who had the near-death experience felt there was some unrealistic or illusory component to what they saw, and also with my medical background, tried to determine if I could find any illusionary or hallucinatory component in what they described, and if there was any illusionary or hallucinatory component, that went into the unreal category. So even with that fairly strict criteria for research, 97.6 of these out-of-body experience observations had absolutely no inapparent inaccuracy. And moreover, many of these out-of-body experience observations described ongoing earthly events far removed from the physical body. We would have people that had cardiac arrest in the operating room, and yet they would describe what their family members were saying in the hospital cafeteria. We'd have people that would be in the emergency room and could describe accurately and in detail what was being said and what they saw of their often frightened and distraught friends and family in the hallway, far removed from the emergency room. So over and over, we're seeing tremendous consistency in what these out-of-body experiences are. As best we can tell, at least for the overwhelming majority, what they seem to see in this out-of-body state is indeed real, and that is absolutely medically inexplicable. But there's another near-death experience element, that being heightened senses. One of the most common things reported in near-death experiences is an overwhelming sense of peace, of joy, of love, of connection, oneness. And we hear that over and over. The great majority of near-death experiences have that. But other types of senses may be enhanced too. Vision may be enhanced. We have a number of near-death experiences where they describe vision occurring in 360 degrees. And amazing, isn't it? I mean, as we sit here today, our visual field is confined to a basically pie-shaped field because that's the location of the eyes in our skull. We can't see around us because that's where our eyes are, and yet in near-death experiences, we often hear a description of 360-degree vision. They can be described being aware, visually aware of things going on above them, below them, beside them, front and back, and all simultaneously. And in fact, speaking of vision, near-death experiences with vision, with strong, detailed vision, have been described in those born totally blind and who remain totally blind throughout their life. And in fact, we have an example of that. This is a Marta G. Marta G, at the age of 5, was legally blind. And for reasons I cannot fathom, even though she was legally blind, she was playing in a lake. I guess she's 5 years old. Perhaps you can excuse that. Parents, you might understand. But at the age of 5, she went into the lake and drowned and became unconscious and had her clothes brushed with death. Marta G's own words right here. This is what can happen during a near-death experience, even if they're legally blind. A beautiful woman, dressed in bright white light, pulled me out and, looking into my eyes, asked me what I wanted. I was completely satisfied and could think of nothing until it occurred to me to take a trip around the lake. I did and saw detail I would never have seen in real life. I could go anywhere, even to the tops of trees, by simply intending to do so. I was legally blind and for the first time saw leaves on trees, birds' feathers, birds' eyes, details on telephone poles and in people's backyards that were far more acute than 20/20 vision. And we have a small series of NDEs that occur under people that are legally blind, and this is very, very consistent in the kinds of experiences we get. Now already a lot of you may be saying, wow, this is some pretty strong evidence that consciousness can exist apart from the body in a very dramatic and vivid way in so many people that have these near-death experiences. Well, certainly it's appropriate to consider that alternative explanations of near-death experience have been proposed. Now, while I believe they're medically inexplicable, I certainly respect and in fact I encourage thoughtful, skeptical considerations of physiological, psychological, or cultural alternative explanations of near-death experience. However, I will tell you, just without going into details of all the alternative explanations, that over 20 of these different explanations have been proposed for NDE. And they really do cover every conceivable physiological, psychological, cultural explanation that you could conceive of and a few you can't conceive of. The reason that there are so many of these alternative explanations for near-death experience is quite simple. That being the skeptics themselves cannot agree on any one or several of these explanations that uniformly make sense, even to them, even to those people that believe there must be a physiological or psychological explanation for near-death experience. The bottom line is there's really no element of near-death experience that's medically explicable by any known physiological or psychological or cultural cause, not any one element, let alone the totality of the evidence, that being what we see the elements of near-death experience on an ongoing basis, not only in my work, but in the work of many, many others doing scholarly study in the field. But moving on, there's certainly a number of other elements that in the interest of time we'll cover relatively briefly. Very often after the out-of-body experience and a near-death experience, they may experience a tunnel. The tunnel is variously described. They're often moving through the tunnel very rapidly. And very often as they're moving through the tunnel, they're approaching a very bright light. The light that is described in near-death experiences is not like the light that we experience on Earth. It has a mystical component. They may describe it as having a personality, an emotion, and presence. So they maybe describe it as bright. We had one near-death experiencer say the mystical light they encountered was like 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 suns, and yet it never seems to hurt their eyes when they look at it. It seems to be something very neat. They may enter unearthly realms. In unearthly realms, they may encounter beautiful landscapes. That they may have flowers, trees, or other living things there with colors and a beauty that is unlike anything that they know on Earth. They may encounter from time to time in near-death experiences music that's described as unearthly, as beauty. There may be buildings, or maybe other beings, almost always compassionate, loving beings that occur in these unearthly realms that are so typically described in near-death experiences. Certainly, you can meet deceased loved ones during near-death experiences. Now, I think this is one thing that separates near-death experiences from all other types of consciousness that I'm aware of. If you look at dreams, hallucinations, any other types of altered consciousness, the great majority of people that you're going to encounter in these experiences are going to be people that are alive at the time of the experience. In your dream or whatever you may encounter, the bank teller that you did business with that day, the family member you said hi to on the way in. And yet with near-death experiences, about 96% of the time when they encounter a being, that being is deceased. In fact, we have a number of case reports where they encounter beings that they actually thought were alive at the time they had their near-death experience, and only found out later that this person actually had died prior to their near-death experience, and they didn't even know about that. And I would emphasize that these are not ghostly or spooky encounters. These are loving, joyous reunions. Even if the deceased individual was debilitated by chronic illness prior to their death, virtually always in near-death experiences, the person they encounter is picture-perfect health. As Dr. Parnia talked a little bit about the life review, these are dramatic and some of the most transformational parts of near-death experiences. About 15 to 20% of people that have a near-death experience may see part or even all of their prior life in review. And some of the times they review all of their prior life. It can be referred to as a panoramic life review. They may see themselves typically interacting with other people throughout their entire life, and remarkably, some of these panoramic life reviews not only involve a reliving of seeing their own interactions, but they feel what they felt when they interacted with the other person. And in some near-death experiences, remarkably, they actually feel, know, and become aware of what the other person was feeling like that interacted with them. And sometimes a considerable surprise when they become aware of what the other person was feeling. One of the real dramatic things we see is sometimes they become aware that the tiniest act of love or kindness, reaching out to other people, seem to be very, very important to that individual's life. And certainly, life reviews are very important. I would emphasize that during life reviews, even though they're seeing much or all of their prior life, there's essentially never a sense of judgment. They don't feel externally judged during their near-death experience for good or bad. It's as if this was your life. You know, seemingly this is information, and seemingly with the hope that hopefully they can learn from it and live their life in some different way. Now, interestingly, near the end of a near-death experience, there may be a decision to return to the body. There's typically another spiritual being or other being around them, typically compassionate or loving, and there may be some communication about whether they should return to their earthly body. Remarkably, the great majority of people, even though they've lived their earthly life for decades, they have friends, family, loved ones, and yet at this time in the near-death experience, typically, the near-death experiencer does not want to leave that realm that they're in. In the near-death experiencer's sense, they have a profound sense that they're home. They feel a peace, intense positive emotions. They feel that they want to stay there. And it actually takes some bit of dialogue, some bit of concept that the near-death, before the near-death experiencer ultimately decides, yes, they're going to go ahead and return to their earthly body. What are the main reasons that they ultimately decide to return to their body? A lot of it has to do with continued needs for lessons about relationships, love in relationships, often with an emphasis on family. And the other major reason that seems to be convincing to near-death experiencers at this time is the concept of lessons. Not specifically defined in general, but the concept that there are lessons unique in their earthly existence that they need to return to go back and learn. I would emphasize that the overwhelming majority of people that have near-death experiences believe that they are real and not hallucinatory, dreamlike, hallucinatory, or anything else. The overwhelming majority of people that have these experiences believe that in every sense of the word that they are real. And it's not surprising from having walked some steps through what a near-death experiencer actually experienced. So at the end of a near-death experience, of course, their first priority is going to be to recover from that which nearly killed them. And yet, after that, over and over, we see the element of changed lives following a near-death experience. As I said, that's a change in beliefs and attitudes that the great majority of near-death experiencers have. Now, this doesn't happen quickly. Very typically, it takes near-death experiencers years, and several studies have estimated 7 years, to fully integrate this profound experience and its changes into their lives. However, these changes are consistently observed both in prospective studies and in retrospective studies. Over and over again in the research I have, I see the impact of personally experiencing an NDE to be profound. Consistently, we see people having an increased belief in an afterlife and a decreased fear of death. That's not surprising, is it? Because after all, when you have a near-death experience, from their perspective, they know what it's like when they die, because they really deep down firmly believe that they experienced it, and that ultimately there's an afterlife, and thus death is nothing to fear. They value loving relationships. They're typically less materialistic. They have an increased belief in God and a whole realm of other important after effects develop following the experience. I'm going to quickly go over just several prospective studies. Whenever you're looking at life changes after a near-death experience, you have to always be aware that retrospective studies of NDE are self-selected people that are in the sample. So perhaps the most convincing evidence about life changes after a near-death experience would come from prospective studies. You start, and the two studies I'll present, a group of cardiac arrest survivors.
This is the end of this video I want to show you. We are almost out of time. I want to thank you for just sitting here and being so patient. We have little time for questions and answers. I just want to thank you for sitting continuously for a long time, 1.5 hours. I hope that you have enjoyed and you have been exposed to new or interesting information. I will take any question that you might have. Thank you very much.
How would you explain that although you think the spirit is an extrasensory entity, how do you explain that near-death experiences are so closely linked with vision and sound and feeling?
Yes, it's a good question. We don't have the complete answer yet, but we have some medical reports that supports that there is something else other than nervous system that produces this consciousness. We might have some sort of other consciousness that continues beyond the point of death, and that's why we are still, this ongoing research is ongoing to find what that could be. We can call it for now a spirit, or something, a consciousness that is independent of body function. So we have to assume something other than material body to be responsible for our inner self. And that's why I think that is what these evidences are telling us and showing us. But of course, there need to be other research to see that what is the quality of this consciousness, what is it made of, how it functions, and so forth. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
I just was wondering, I didn't make it to your first presentation. What is your reason for putting on these presentations?
The reasoning? I was thinking that because when I was exposed to this new information, I was a kind of sort of a materialist person. I was very proud of it. And I was thinking that as a scientist, I just believe in everything that science can find. And whenever somebody was talking to me about something that the science couldn't prove, especially about spirituality, I was thinking that don't waste your time and mine. There's nothing, no proof to that. But when I came across, my major is not psychiatry or anything similar to these, but when I came across these evidences or the medical journals, the medical papers, I became interested to read because I was thinking, okay, now we have some sort of scientific evidence to prove or to show that we have something beyond the material aspect of our being. So if something exists, I want to find that. And so this started my own journey of finding new thing about myself, and probably I was thinking that it might be useful for other people also to find new facts about themselves. And right now, after 2 years, I just followed these reports, papers, and so forth. I myself, personally, I was convinced, Esam was convinced that there is more to our being than the material body. But everybody has to do this journey for his or her own. And it's up to you that how much you want to do. But I presented this material as an kind of inspiration for you to tell you that there are really things out there, but you might not be seeing it on TV, but you can certainly find it on internet. And you can read these papers, these reports, and follow this line of research to see what else we can find to support the theory that we are not just a material being. And if it is something else to us, other than our material body, I'm very curious to know what that is, and I want to discover that about myself. Thank you very much. Thank you again for attending.